The world had ended before most could even realize it. One moment, people were going about their normal lives, school, work, errands, and the next, chaos erupted like a thunderstorm, turning civilization into a forgotten memory. A strange virus swept through the population, and within days, those infected became nothing more than mindless, savage creatures. Zombies, the remnants of what used to be human, roamed the earth, driven only by hunger. Max was one of the few who had survived the initial outbreak. For months, he had learned to keep his head down, to avoid large crowds, and to live off the meager supplies scavenged from abandoned homes and stores. The city he once called home had been reduced to a ghost town, with broken windows and rusted cars scattered across the streets. Each day, it felt like he was living on borrowed time. His small apartment in the heart of the city had once been a place of comfort, but now it felt like a prison. The walls, once painted in warm colors, now seemed cold and distant. He had tried to make it a haven of sorts, securing windows with heavy planks of wood and fortifying the door with what little he had. But no amount of preparation could erase the gnawing fear that always lingered. He was alone. Max had witnessed the world crumble. He had watched helplessly as his family and friends fell to the infection, their faces contorted into grotesque, unrecognizable versions of themselves. He had seen the city's once vibrant streets turn into hunting grounds for the undead, and in the midst of all that chaos, he had learned something crucial. Survival was everything. This morning felt different, though. Max had always kept a routine, scavenging for food, checking his weapons, ensuring his escape routes were clear. But today there was an unsettling silence in the air. The wind didn't rustle the leaves. There were no distant growls or shrieks. The city was eerily still. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and they were screaming at him to be cautious. He grabbed his backpack, now stuffed with cans of food, a flashlight, a few extra bullets, and his most prized possession, his knife. It wasn't much, but in a world like this, it was enough. Slipping his arms through the straps, he made his way to the window, peering out cautiously. The streets were empty, almost too empty. Max frowned, his heart racing. Zombies were unpredictable, but they weren't known for being quiet. Something wasn't right. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang. The sound came from the direction of a nearby alley, followed by a string of desperate screams. Max's blood ran cold. It was human. Someone was alive, or at least trying to stay that way. The need to help was overwhelming. But so was the fear that any attempt could cost him his life. He had learned the hard way that trusting strangers in this new world often led to betrayal. Max hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the window frame. He had no guarantee that whoever was out there wasn't already surrounded by zombies, or worse, a trap set by other desperate survivors. But as the screams grew more frantic, he made his decision. One last chance, Max muttered to himself. One last chance to do something right. He grabbed his gun, tucked it into the waistband of his jeans, and pulled his jacket tighter. Moving quickly, he slipped out the back door and into the shadowed alley behind the apartment complex. The stench of decay hung thick in the air, making him gag, but he pushed forward. His senses were on high alert. Every step felt like it could be his last. The alley opened up into a small courtyard. At the far end, he could just make out the silhouette of a woman, her back pressed against a crumbling brick wall. Surrounding her were at least 4 zombies, their mouths dripping with saliva as they moaned, inching closer to their prey. Max's heart pounded in his chest as he crouched down, trying to remain unseen. The woman was fighting back, swinging a broken piece of wood like a makeshift club, but it was clear she wouldn't last long. The zombies were closing in. Max took a deep breath, then raised his gun, aiming carefully. He didn't want to miss. Bang! The first zombie fell with a thud, the shot echoing in the empty courtyard. The others turned, startled, and Max took the opportunity to shoot again. 2 more dropped, and the 4th stumbled back, momentarily disoriented. Max didn't hesitate. He ran toward the woman, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her toward the alley. "Come on," he shouted, his voice sharp. "Move." She didn't resist, though her face was pale and bloodied. She was in shock, but she seemed to understand the urgency. Together, they ran toward the safety of his apartment building, Max's gun held tightly in his hand. As they reached the back door, Max slammed it shut behind them, his heart still racing. The woman collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. Max was already scanning the area for any sign of danger. They were safe, for now. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Max nodded, though his mind was already moving. They couldn't stay here long. The zombies would have heard the gunshots. He needed to make plans. Fast. "We need to get out of the city," Max said, his voice steady despite the panic surging inside him. "And we need to do it now." Little did they know, their journey had only just begun. The woman, whose name turned out to be Claire, stood shakily, leaning against the wall for support. Max watched her carefully, trying to gauge how much she could handle. She was younger than he had first thought, maybe mid-20s, but the toll of the world had aged her far beyond her years. Her clothes were torn, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of someone who had been fighting to survive for far too long. "We need to move," Max repeated, his voice firm. "They'll be here soon. Zombies don't like to be left hanging around." Claire nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. I thought I was the only one left," she said softly. "I've been on my own for days, hiding, scavenging where I could." Max's stomach twisted with sympathy. He knew the feeling of isolation all too well. Still, they couldn't linger on it. Time was a luxury they didn't have. "Follow me," Max said, leading the way toward a narrow stairwell at the back of the building. The stairs creaked underfoot as they ascended, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent city. They reached the roof access, and Max paused, scanning the street below for any signs of movement. He was looking for a way out, some kind of route that could get them beyond the heart of the city and into the countryside, where there was a better chance of survival. They made it to the roof and crouched low behind a chimney, keeping out of sight. The wind had picked up, carrying the unmistakable stench of decay and death. Max's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the area below. They couldn't stay here too long, not with zombies just a few blocks away. His mind raced through possible escape routes, but they needed to move fast. "Where did you come from?" Max asked, trying to distract himself from the growing pressure of time. "How did you end up in the city?" Claire hesitated before answering. "I was with a group, but it didn't last. Things went south fast. We tried to head north, but the roads were blocked. Zombies everywhere. I barely made it out of there." Max's gaze softened, but he kept his thoughts to himself. The world was full of stories like hers. Groups of people who had started out together, only to fall apart when it all became too much to handle. The collapse of society was as brutal as it was inevitable. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Max asked, watching her closely. The question seemed to make her tense. "I don't know," she replied, her voice cracking. "I was heading for the mountains. They say there's a community there, people still holding out." Max's brow furrowed. A community. That was the first he had heard of anything like it. He had always assumed that every settlement had long since fallen, consumed by the zombies or turned into desperate, savage camps. The idea of a haven seemed too good to be true. Claire noticed his skepticism. "You don't believe me, do you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Max shrugged, his gaze drifting back to the streets below. "I'd want to," he said honestly, "but it's hard to hold on to hope after everything that's happened. People out here, they're unpredictable, desperate. It's not always about survival. Sometimes it's about power. And in a place like this, that can be deadly." Claire didn't argue. Instead, she turned away, staring at the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip, casting the world in a murky orange glow. The city was a sea of ruin below them, and the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that they'd be swallowed by it. Max stood, his fingers tapping against the handle of his gun. "Look, I'm not saying we need to trust every word of what you heard, but the mountains are our best shot, and we need to get out of this city before it's too late." Claire gave him a steady look, nodding in agreement. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." They gathered their things and moved quickly, climbing down to the ground level. Max led the way, navigating through alleyways and back streets, staying as far from the main roads as possible. He knew the noise of the gunshots would have attracted attention, and they needed to stay hidden. Claire kept close, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, her pace slower than Max's but still determined. Hours passed as they moved deeper into the city, always on the lookout for danger. Max had taught himself to be silent, his every movement calculated, controlled. Claire, on the other hand, seemed more distracted, her eyes often darting toward distant sounds. Max understood. She had just escaped death. Her nerves were frayed, her mind racing through every close call. By the time they reached the edge of the city, the sun had fully set, and the first stars had begun to appear in the darkened sky. The city behind them was an ominous silhouette, its towering buildings now nothing more than jagged teeth against the night. They stopped for a moment, catching their breath. Max turned to Claire. "This is it," he said. "We head north from here. If we can make it past the woods, we might find shelter in the hills." Claire nodded, though the tension in her eyes hadn't eased. She opened her mouth to speak, but then a distant sound reached their ears, faint at first, but growing louder. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. Max's heart sank. "Run," he said urgently. "Now." Without a word, Claire broke into a sprint, her legs moving faster than Max had expected. He followed her, but as they ran, Max could hear the unmistakable shuffle of more feet behind them, more zombies, closer now, drawn by the sound of their hurried escape. It was going to be a long night, and the real test of survival had only just begun. Max and Claire raced through the darkened streets, their breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as they pushed themselves harder than they ever had before. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but there was no time to stop and catch their breath. The unmistakable shuffle of zombie feet echoed behind them, and it was growing louder, closer. Max could feel the dread creeping up on him like a cold shadow. "Keep going," Max shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. His legs burned, but he didn't dare slow down. Claire was just ahead, and though she was faster than Max expected, her form was becoming less steady. He could see her stumbling every few steps, exhaustion taking its toll. They turned down a narrow street, hoping to lose the zombies in the maze of buildings. But every corner seemed to lead to another dead end, or another wave of distant groans and grunts. The city was no longer a place of refuge. It was a hunting ground, a maze that preyed on the weak, the lost. "Over here," Max shouted, veering toward an old, dilapidated storefront with a crumbling door half ajar. It looked abandoned, but that didn't necessarily mean it was safe. They didn't have the luxury of choice. Claire reached the door first, her hand trembling as she pushed it open, wincing at the creak. Max slammed the door behind them, just as the first groans of the zombies reached the corner. It wasn't much of a hideout, but it would have to do for now. Inside, the room was dark, the air stale with the smell of mildew and rot. Max's eyes adjusted quickly to the shadows as he motioned for Claire to keep quiet. They crouched down behind a broken counter, listening. The zombies were close, their groans growing more distant now, but they were still too near. Max peered through a crack in the boarded-up window, watching as the creatures passed by, their empty eyes scanning the area. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't hear the pounding of their hearts or the rustle of movement from the two survivors. It was too close. He felt it in his bones. The constant threat of being torn apart by those mindless, ravenous creatures was something he could never truly grow used to. "Are they gone?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Max didn't answer right away. His focus was still on the street. He needed to be sure they weren't being followed. The sounds of the zombies' movements slowly faded into the distance, and Max finally allowed himself to relax, albeit just a little. His heart was still racing, adrenaline flooding his system. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "They're gone for now, but we can't stay here long." Claire nodded, though her body was slumped with exhaustion. She looked at him, her face pale in the dim light. "What now?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Where do we go?" "We're just running in circles." Max stood slowly, his muscles aching with the strain of the constant movement. He moved toward the back of the building, where the hallway was filled with old, forgotten objects. The silence felt suffocating, and the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. But he couldn't afford to give in to it. They had a goal, a direction, however uncertain it might be, and that had to be enough. "We head north," Max said. "You said there's a community in the mountains. That's where we're going." Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "You really think they're still there? A group of survivors, just waiting for us?" "I don't know," Max replied honestly. "But it's the best lead we've got. Better than just wandering aimlessly through this hell." She didn't respond at first, and Max felt a twinge of guilt. He couldn't blame her for doubting. Every survivor had their own scars, physical, emotional, or both. And he had learned long ago that trusting others could sometimes lead to betrayal or worse. But Claire didn't strike him as the type to abandon anyone. Not after everything she had been through. If she believed in the possibility of a safe haven, maybe he could believe in it too. Claire finally stood, brushing dust from her clothes. "Okay, north it is." Max reached for his pack, which he dropped by the counter earlier. They had a long way to go, and even though the mountain range wasn't that far, the journey was fraught with dangers. Zombies, other survivors, people who were far less trustworthy, bandits, wild animals, starvation, all threats that lurked in the shadows of the world they now lived in. He checked his gun, loaded but only a few rounds left. He still had his knife, but ammo was scarce. "We need to move fast," Max said, his voice hardening. "And stay quiet." Claire nodded, but as they moved toward the back exit, she hesitated. "Max," she said, catching his arm, "what if this community is a lie? What if there's nothing there?" Max turned to face her, his expression hardening with resolve. "Then we die trying to find out. But we're not going to give up just yet. Not while there's still a chance." They moved out into the alley behind the building, the cold wind biting at their skin as they stepped out into the night. The sound of the wind and the distant groans of the undead filled the silence as they made their way toward the edge of the city. The night felt endless as they traveled through the desolate streets, every corner hiding potential danger. But Max and Claire pushed forward, driven by the slim hope that the mountains would offer them the refuge they desperately needed. Just as they approached the outskirts of the city, an eerie, muffled sound reached their ears, a low, guttural growl. Max froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his waist. The unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from the shadows. But this time, it wasn't just a few zombies. A whole horde was heading their way. "Run," Max shouted, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her into a sprint. The road to the mountains was waiting, but the real test was about to begin. The night was thick with the stench of death as Max and Claire sprinted through the shadows, the ground beneath their feet uneven and treacherous. The sound of the approaching horde grew louder with each passing second, an almost rhythmic shuffle, like a macabre parade that never ended. Max's heart hammered in his chest, and Claire, breathless and terrified, struggled to keep up. "Faster," Max urged, his voice grating with urgency. They rounded a corner, the moonlight casting long, twisted shadows across the street. There was no time to think, only to run. The horde was closing in fast, And though Max had an inkling that they might be able to outrun the zombies, he knew the odds were slim. He'd already had close calls. But this was different. The sheer number of the undead made it nearly impossible to avoid them for long. "Over here," Max shouted, dragging Claire toward an old rusted fire escape ladder. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but if they could get up high, they might stand a chance. Claire's face was pale, her movements sluggish with exhaustion, but she followed his lead, her hand gripping his arm as she climbed behind him. They'd reached the roof of the building just as the first of the zombies stumbled into the street below, their eyes vacant and mouths gaping. Max looked around, trying to get his bearings. The streets were a labyrinth, a never-ending maze of alleys, broken buildings, and abandoned vehicles. They had no clear path, no sure way forward. But there was one thing they did know. They couldn't stay where they were. Up ahead, through the park, Max muttered to Claire, pointing toward a thick patch of trees and overgrown grass just beyond the rooftops. "If we can get through there, we'll be able to find a safer route." Claire nodded without speaking, her eyes wide with fear. The zombies were already starting to clamber below, their growls mixing with the shrill whine of the wind. Max took one last glance at the building's edge to ensure no other zombies were scaling the fire escape before he moved toward the exit. They crept down from the roof, carefully climbing back into the alley, staying in the shadows. The city had become a labyrinth of dangers, and with every corner turned, the risk of encountering more of the undead seemed higher. But they had no choice. The park was the only possible route that could lead them beyond the city's borders and toward the mountains. As they made their way toward the park's entrance, the distant howls of zombies echoed through the streets. They were being hunted, not just by the infected, but by a city that had long since become their graveyard. The park, a place that once symbolized peace and life, now felt like a final frontier, the last bastion of survival. Max's fingers tightened around his gun, the metal cold against his skin. He knew that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The mountains might hold refuge, but they also held unknown dangers. There were whispers of bands of survivors, raiders who killed for supplies, cannibalistic groups who had lost what little humanity they had left. And in this new world, there was no one to trust. Claire seemed to sense his apprehension, and she reached out, touching his arm gently. "We'll make it. We have to." Max glanced at her, offering a brief nod. "We will." They entered the park cautiously, the dense foliage providing some cover from the open streets. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. For a moment, the world felt still, too still. But it didn't last. The sounds of the city, the groans, the shuffling, had receded, but the tension was thick in the air. Suddenly, a rustling noise from the bushes ahead made Max freeze. His grip on his gun tightened, and Claire's eyes widened. They were close, too close. Max motioned for Claire to stay low as he inched forward, his feet barely making a sound on the cracked earth beneath them. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a figure emerged. A man. Max's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to raise his weapon, but the man held up his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Hey," the man said, his voice rough but not hostile. "I'm not one of them." Max didn't lower his gun but didn't raise it either. He sized the man up quickly. He appeared middle-aged, dressed in tattered clothes, but his face was clean-shaven, his eyes sharp. He was alone, or at least that's what he wanted them to believe. "Who are you?" Max asked, his voice low but steady. "Name's Luke," the man replied. "I was just looking for somewhere safe to crash. Didn't expect to run into people." Max's suspicion flared. "Where's your group?" he asked. The man's presence didn't sit right with him. In this world, people didn't wander alone unless they had no choice. Luke hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting around the park, as though expecting someone, or something, else to emerge from the trees. I'm alone," he said finally. "My group." He paused again. "They didn't make it. I've been moving solo for a while now. Claire looked at Max, her eyes filled with uncertainty. He looks okay, she whispered. Maybe we can trust him. Max wasn't so sure. Trust in the new world was a rare commodity, and it had cost him more than once. Still, they were running out of time, and the horde was closing in. His mind raced. A stranger, alone and claiming to be lost. The possibility of danger was real, but they had no other option. All right, Max said after a long pause, lowering his gun slightly but keeping a tight grip on it. You can travel with us. For now. But if you do anything to put us at risk, I won't hesitate. Luke nodded quickly, showing his hands in a gesture of peace. Fair enough, he said, a hint of a smile flickering on his face. I'm just trying to survive, same as you. Max didn't trust the man fully, but he had no other choice. They were heading in the same direction, the mountains, and maybe, just maybe, this man knew something they didn't. They continued forward, the park's dense shadows concealing their every step. But Max knew one thing for sure. The real test was ahead. There was a world of uncertainty waiting for them. And it was a world that no one could truly prepare for. As they left the park behind and approached the outskirts of the city, the horde far in the distance, Max looked ahead into the unknown wilderness. The mountains loomed large, their peaks barely visible against the night sky. This was just the beginning of their journey, one that would test everything they had left. Their strength, their trust, and their very will to survive. The shadows of the past still loomed large, but Max and Claire were ready to face them head-on. And whatever awaited them in the mountains, they would face it together.